So let me talk a little bit about what we've been working on over the last few weeks. So we've had a few companies come to us. I think what we're seeing is that there's a lot of people, there's a lot of, this is kind of a theme we've seen before. There's a lot of people building MCP things, not a lot of people really thinking about enough about the UX and the user, really the user experience of how to actually implement those. And actually we found people, it's very easy to spin things up, but it's not as easy to make them really useful. And actually there's a lot of little weird quirks that happen. Like there's some issues with it's transitioning between some of the modes of MCP apps and OpenAI. Stuff doesn't work properly. And I think what people are coming to us say, hey, can you help us do this? Because it's not our core skill set. We want to focus on the back end stuff and not what about the UX, even though it's obviously very important. So we've done one project for a company in travel, which has been interesting. And we've got another project in payments, who really want to rework how they want to do their kind of really integrate MCP with their backend and make that, sort of best of breed, how they actually the user interacts with their product. Because I think one of the things that people miss is that MCP apps not only provide the apps for people, but they also kind of force that functionality to be available for agentic behavior as well. So it's kind of like a double win that everyone kind of really gets around. So I think it's a useful tool to have. But obviously, I think the mindshare over the last few weeks has really been very much around sort of the open core skills and CLI kind of focus that a lot of people have seen. But yeah, it's been interesting, I think, the last couple of weeks. Don't you think, Jason?
Yeah, definitely. And one thing that keeps coming up is, well, they want to be prepared to run their MCP apps in different tools, right? In different platforms. So they're not only looking at ChatGPT apps, but they are like, okay, we want to build this in a way that is reusable and universal using MCP standard to be able to publish on whatever comes next. So we touch on Claude connectors. We'll probably see some more coming up soon. So I think one reason for that is, well, common sense in terms of, hey, I don't want to just like limit myself. But the other maybe reason I can infer from people talking about this is that they are becoming a bit less um, trustful in ChatGPT, as they are like maybe, well, taking more time in delivering the discoverability that we keep discussing about, and some other features that will make their apps shine in ChatGPT. So maybe they're like, okay, let me just not put all my eggs in this basket, and just let me look at what else we can do with our MCP apps. That's also something I've been seeing, like some kind of distrust maybe.
Well, I mean, one of the things just happened, I think this week was, or last week, ChatGPT has basically stopped trying to be the commerce provider. They're not stopped trying to do they've closed off some of their instant checkout, I think, with this experiment that we're running. So yeah, they had the thing, they had it available for only a few providers, like I think Target, where we can actually check out, but it looks like they've kind of stopped pursuing that. I don't know if they're going to rework it and do different things, because it's obviously a really valuable thing to get right. But it's been interesting to see that hasn't progressed. And I think, and still people are waiting for the discoverability thing to kick in, which we've been waiting for months, which will really unlock things. But the other thing that's interesting actually on this is that using Elliot's app discoverability, that there's a lot of more Claude connectors now. The Claude connector is slowly catching up with the number of apps that they have in the ChatGPT app store. So it's kind of becoming a bit more balanced. And then at some point, I guess we'll see a Copilot one as well. But I guess that's I haven't heard any more about that yet.
Then
yeah, so one of the things that was announced a couple of weeks ago was that Microsoft had enabled MCP apps in Copilot. I think we touched this in an earlier episode. So yeah, in theory, that's going to be a very valuable user base of business users rather than just sort of free users. you got 400 million business users who are going to be able to use MCP apps, which will open up a whole bunch of new use cases and people being, interested in this. And I'm guessing there's going to be a Microsoft App Store for Copilot at some point to unlock that.
Right. And I think for, I think a lot of our audience might not know because when a lot of developers first think about Copilot, they think about the facility that's available through Visual Studio Code, right? Where like
Yeah.
GitHub Copilot was like one of the first things to come out, and that sort of was Microsoft's first product, and like was a pioneer in this space, right? Eventually displaced by things like Cursor and whatever. But what you're talking about is actually a different product that came out in 2024, which was the Office Copilot, right? Which is sort of the
Yes.
more
I mean,
it has a
I
lot of
think,
use, but it's sort of hidden from from
yeah.
people.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think people, if you're in the Microsoft ecosystem, you know about it more. But I think that Microsoft have kind of just broadened the focus of what Copilot does to basically be Microsoft Copilot for anything Microsoft. So yeah, it obviously started off being the sort of the coding thing, but now it's any sort of Office product or any of the Microsoft products it's there for. And so it's a very interesting market potentially if they depending on where they go with it. And again, a lot of this is very much in flux for everybody at the moment. But I think the clear thing for me is that MCP apps are going to be an important part of the ecosystem, whatever happens. It's just going to be, I think the question is really going to be how the different companies implement them.
Another thing that is kind of surprising to me is that what we are seeing in people who we are working with, or what we're seeing on the market is they are now trying to bring a lot of the what we would call like basic fundamental processes into MCP apps or MCP in general, which is like Toby mentioned payments. So that is something that OpenAI in ChatGPT apps experimented with in terms of purchasing, but then we see these other companies that are trying to provide, like something that takes care of payments in an agentic workflow and using MCPs for these apps. So I think it's still very early days in terms of there's still so much to do, right? Like even payments is or authentication, and even those things are like still nascent, and they haven't been figured out yet completely. And something that we keep discussing about is also how payments are going to shape a different way of consuming these apps, because these products are not going to be probably not on a subscription basis, but rather on a usage basis. So that to me is really interesting. How will that change the consumer behavior when you don't want to pay for a $20 subscription that fits all, but rather you pay on an usage basis and just pay for whatever you want to unlock at that specific moment in that specific context. So I think a lot of companies might be looking at that part of the ecosystem, and I think there's a lot of work to be done there, not only technically, but also, or maybe especially on the UX side of things.
Well, Ray, what about from your ecosystem and state change? I mean, how are they thinking about sort of MCP and some of these changes?
We're now seeing deployment having basically three modalities practically for every app. And those modalities are your user facing, right? So what's your primary user experience, the web app, what have you. The MCP to be able to talk to mostly network layer AI, and like that's
Yeah,
where ChatGPT and Claude are both really at that network layer because you can only experience them as network services. Right. And then you have, what we call local layer AI, which is, Claude Code, even Cowork, Codex, these tools, and OpenClaw also falls in this category, things where you have access to a file system to work with. Right. And when we talk about like the
yeah.
difference between like being more MCP oriented versus being skill oriented, the P in MCP is the protocol. Right. And the protocols become important when you're talking over the network. And the
Yeah.
the brilliance of skills is the insight that, like, if you're running something that's local, that doesn't it isn't, have to go over and use this cloud-based service, you don't need a protocol. You can just sort of keep files around. And instead of having to go run a specific, kind of search algo, you could just use grep, right? Which is a tool that's loaded onto these machines that allows them to scan text
Yeah.
files. And the and then because there's just such a difference in the way these three types of experiences work, that has been sort of the upcoming insight, that the, hey, what am I actually putting to my front end? That front end usually has to have AI help to it, right? That's where you might have a copilot inside your app, right? And then you have MCP, which is where you're putting your app inside the AI, which is something we've talked about before. And then the third level, which is one that's really sort of novel, I think, or in terms of its popularity at least. Skills have been out for about 6 months, but I think really popularized in the last 90 days. I think first introduced by Anthropic, but then made much more popular by Vercel, right? And skills.sh, which is this repository of a whole lot of, skills. And all they are text files, right? And the
Yeah.
simplicity, the distribution has just been remarkable. Like, the initial skills, as you might imagine, were very much about how do you build software, right? Like, hey, I'm going to use a coding agent to go make code. And then other folks have started to get very clever about this. Corey Haynes, who's a well-known marketing influencer, more recently, Sahil Levine over at Gumroad, and Gary Tan at Y Combinator.
Yeah.
They've
Yeah.
all released packs of skills, text files basically, of which reflect their knowledge, right? Which can then get fed into AI. And I think this is putting more pressure on the network layer AI, like the ChatGPTs and the Claudes, to be able to get access to more of that content, because that content is so useful, especially when done through progressive disclosure, for making the AI able to help you better, right? Help you having the AI make better decisions, having it give better counsel, having it just do smarter stuff. And the other thing it eventually does is, now that you have this greater level of intelligence, how do you convey that? How do you bring the user back into it? And that is something where, like, I'm seeing that the local AI, like the open clause and the cloud codes, do what they do very well is move the ball forward. What they don't do very well is communicate with the user. Like, if you've ever seen like the wall of text, which is bad enough when you're looking at ChatGPT because it's all formatted, Markdown, but you're looking at that through a terminal, like the terminal version of like Cloud Code, it
Yeah.
can
It's
be
super annoying.
nearly illegible, right? Like, what am I supposed to do with all this? And like
Yeah. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
shift up those modalities, I think, becomes important. And that's where I think MCP, I think particularly the MCP apps and the MCP UI insight that came from that about 9 months ago, that's where MCP, I think, adds the most value, right? Is over and above the fact that it works in the network, works in the cloud, is this idea of like being able to bring that a way of thinking about how we're supposed to embed richer, feedback to the user, so that they can be involved in making much, much better decisions. And that's one of the things
Yeah.
we all, that composition becomes the most important part of like what really drives value. We saw that with the Excalibur thing. That's what I was doing with the explainer video MCP, which we can also talk about a little bit if you like. But the but that composition and that question, like, how do we get more into the user's brain, is sort of the big unsolved question, and I think we've got some of the pieces of the puzzle around us.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things that really strike me is, I mean, and obviously there's various ecosystems like the Vercel's one, but the distribution of skills hasn't really been. It's coming from a different direction. I mean, with MCP, pretty early on, OpenAI came out with, yeah, hey, here is an app store for this, so we can, and this is how you manage it. Whereas the sort of skill thing's been much more organic in that people just created repos and said, hey, look, you can just use it, here you go. There isn't really, people tried to do like directories and things, but it hasn't really been like any of the organizations come out and said, this is going to be our sort of skill store that you can access. And I don't know, some skills are a premium, cost money or whatever. There hasn't been anything like that yet, which is interesting. And then the other thing that I think, so I think that's going to be interesting to see if anything does become more organized in terms of distributing skills or putting more sort of uh, monetization behind the skills. Because at the moment, if people are very much happy to give it away and say, "Oh, look, it's just some text. It's not really a lot of. It's not super premium here. Everyone can share on it." And I think it was really amplified by the whole OpenClaw thing, which was very much driven by picking up new skills, searching skills, and picking stuff up, and not having any kind of paywall in the way. So I was able to kind of get this crazy kind of sort of behaviors without anyone really knowing what was going on. So I think it's interesting they're coming from different directions, and I do wonder if there's going to be any sort of some consolidation around, building this more app store, or the other way around, where, is there an opportunity for skills to gain some sort of generative UI to help people consume what the skill is producing, and saying, when you talk to me, these are the sorts of ways of presenting this data, so that people can then use it and kind of sort of analyze and understand the data better than just getting the weird text. I mean, part of the issue comes from the fact that historically a lot of the skills have been coming from these very much sort of CLI based areas where there's not a lot of opportunity to do interesting UI other than make text look pretty, which isn't always easy to consume. So I think I feel like there's going to be some sort of merging of these different ways of approaching, where skills will benefit some of the stuff that MCP's done, and probably vice versa as well. But it's not clear yet how that's going to go. I imagine that all of the major model houses like OpenAI and Anthropic are working very hard on this. I mean, it's interesting to me in a way. I think, certainly from my perspective, Anthropic's been killing it for the last few weeks. I mean, they've been delivering all sorts of functionality all over the place. Really consistent, like new, interesting features all the time. Whereas OpenAI they haven't done a lot over the last. I mean, imagine they've been buying up people and stuff, but they haven't delivered an awful lot. So I'm guessing there's going to be all sorts of cool stuff that's going to come soon, but it hasn't been anything just yet for a while.
Fair enough. Although I would say that we can probably put everything that's happening in OpenClaw in the last 6 weeks in OpenAI's credit account, because
Okay.
Steinberger working for them since the beginning of February.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, I think that what you were just talking about, I thought gets to a key tension in the world of AI, which is the tension between ease of use and power, right? And that the ChatGPT, in order to be successful, needs to be easy to use, but AI broadly, in order to be successful, needs to be powerful. And you hear that when like the people like Altman or Dario, they talk about AGI, right? That's their big objective. They want to make that's where they're keeping their focus. That's where they want their companies to go. It's just more powerful AI, and a lot of what you see on the sort of the next level down is a big war of how to make that harness level, unlock more power for people, more access to data, more access to context, more access to just the better pathways, right, to get it to create value. And then and I'm generally finding that in AI, the rough and ready, but you know unlocking software is winning on the regular over the more refined, carefully designed stuff. Than the and the and I've been surprised by that, because people are like, well, we can't go too fast because we want to make sure our design is good. By the time they bring it out, they're very late to the party. So like
Yeah.
and I think one of the challenges you're describing with ChatGPT is, on the one hand, they're not looking to unbalance the fact they have whatever 800 million plus weeklies, or whatever their stat is. Probably the simple, but Claude, because it's the up and comer, they're like, okay, how can we get more power in this thing? How can we get the generative AI, the generative UI that they introduce support for, which is very very cool. How can we just and also make it integrate, like the Claude app, right? It has both Claude Chat and Cowork and Code, clearly trying to pull people more towards the it's somewhat harder to use but more powerful zone, as opposed to ChatGPT, which seems to be, at least right now, not upsetting the surfboard. And that's the reason why I have like a separation between like their Codex app and their ChatGPT app. And like so I think the question like which way the market's getting pulled is a useful question. And also sort of brings back, okay, how can better UI help the pursuit of power, right? Rather than be we don't want to go too fast. We need to make this thing friendlier. But rather, how can we go faster by making it friendlier?
Interestingly, I did see an article that was saying that OpenAI was going to make an all-in-one app.
Yep.
They're gonna
But
combine Codex and ChatGPT. So they are. It looks like that's going to be the way that things are going to go. And it was also interesting to see the way that Claude implemented. I mean, Claude Code obviously started out being a CLI, but they then added it into their desktop app. So that, yeah, I mean, effectively, and that kind of unlocked the ability to do UI things outside of the CLI. So it does feel like it's moving in that direction, I guess. But yeah, it does. The other thing I get a feeling of, and again, this is all feeling, and I'm completely wrong, but it feels a bit like Anthropic is doing sort of small incremental things rather than anything big bang, and it's kind of feeling its way, but kind of making interesting choices based on what's worked in the past and progressing. Whereas OpenAI seems to do more big bang things. It like does, it kind of saves things up and then does big launches. Whereas a lot of the Anthropic stuff seems to be kind of relatively low key and then kind of comes out, and then some of it works, some of it doesn't, and they just keep knocking things, pushing stuff out. And I don't know. That's just the impression I got. But yeah, as I say, it's going to be. I think the next few months are going to be, as the last few months were, very interesting to see, where this goes. And actually, I would like to maybe dig into your explainer video, because one of the things I think is really interesting about that is the use of remotion. Again, I don't know a lot about remotion, but just for the people who don't know, well, maybe you can explain it, because I think it's a really interesting. For me, it's a very classically useful thing for the sort of local stuff. I mean, effectively, you can make videos in lots of different ways, but
Mhm.
being able to sort of leverage, and it's a clever way of leveraging kind of React and video locally, right? So it's well, you want to explain it because you know much better than I do, I'm sure.
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to. How's the screen looking to you?